Picture a city under siege, but not by invading armies or raging fires. The streets of ancient Mesopotamia echo with muffled groans, doors barred against the night. Something moves in the shadows, something that shouldn't be walking. The air is thick with the scent of decay and the whispered prayers of those who still cling to life. This isn't just any plague, it's a horror beyond fever or famine. The dead are rising, hungering for the living, and according to crumbling clay tablets and long-forgotten myths, this nightmare was all too real. For centuries, the legend of Mesopotamia's zombie plague has lurked in the edges of history, a chilling tale passed down through hushed voices. But why would one of the world's first great civilizations fear the walking dead? What could have sparked such a terrifying belief in an era before horror movies or viral pandemics? The answer lies in humanity's oldest fears: the dread of contagion, the terror of losing control, and the unshakable question, what if death isn't the end? These myths aren't just campfire stories, they're a window into how our ancestors grappled with the unknown, turning their darkest anxieties into legends that still haunt us today. So let's journey back to the cradle of civilization, where the line between myth and reality blurs. We'll decipher ancient texts, unearth clues hidden in rituals, and piece together how a society that gave us writing, law, and astronomy could also be consumed by tales of the undead. By the end, you'll see these stories not as mere superstition, but as a mirror held up to our own deepest fears, because some terrors, it seems, are truly timeless. The dead may not walk among us now, but the fear they inspired, that's very much alive. Mesopotamia wasn't just a land of towering ziggurats and bustling markets. It was a world where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural blurred daily. To understand why the undead haunted their nightmares, we need to step into their shoes, into a civilization where every cough, every fever, could be a sign of divine wrath or demonic possession. Medicine here wasn't just about herbs and bandages, it was tangled with incantations and rituals. Healers doubled as priests, scribbling cuneiform prescriptions that mixed crushed herbs with pleas to the gods. When a plague swept through the crowded streets of Ur or Babylon, it wasn't just a biological disaster, it was an omen, a punishment, or worse, a breach in the cosmic order. Take Babylon, for example. This city of hanging gardens and law codes was also a place where people carried amulets to ward off restless spirits. Mesopotamians believed the dead could return, not as benevolent ancestors, but as vengeful ghosts, especially if they died violently or were denied proper burial rites. Clay tablets describe etimu, lost souls trapped between worlds, their hunger echoing in the night. And when disease struck in waves, it's no surprise they feared the dead might be dragging the living into their torment. But here's the chilling twist. Their medical texts reveal eerie parallels between zombie myths and real illnesses. Some symptoms described in ancient records, stiff limbs, delirium, even a ravenous appetite, mirror conditions like rabies or tetanus. Imagine witnessing someone in the throes of such a disease, their body rigid, their eyes wild. Without modern science, how else would you explain it except as a curse? A soul tethered to its rotting flesh, societal structure deepened the terror. Cities like Ur were tightly packed, with canals and alleys perfect for contagion and superstition. When a neighbor suddenly shambled through the marketplace, feverish and deranged, rumors spread faster than the illness itself. The elites might blame a neglected god, while the poor whispered of witchcraft. And in the shadows of the ziggurats, where priests decoded omens in sheep livers, even the most rational minds wondered, had the gods unleashed something far worse than death? This wasn't just fear of disease, it was fear of collapse. Mesopotamia's empires thrived on order, from Hammurabi's laws to the precise movements of celestial scribes tracking the stars. A plague that turned victims into monsters wasn't just a health crisis, it was chaos incarnate, a sign that the universe itself was unraveling. So they fought back the only way they knew how, with clay figurines buried at city gates to trap evil spirits, with exorcisms chanted over trembling bodies, with myths that gave shape to the horror. Because if you could name the thing stalking the night, maybe, just maybe, you could survive it. The earliest hints of Mesopotamia's zombie plague don't come from dusty scrolls or exaggerated epic poems. They're etched into fragile clay tablets, some nearly 4,000 years old. Among the thousands of cuneiform records detailing harvests, laws, and star charts, a handful stand out for their unsettling descriptions. Take the so-called medical tablet, discovered near the ruins of the Great Ziggurat. It lists symptoms like the limbs refusing to rest, the mouth hungering though the belly is full, and most chillingly, the dead eyes that see though the soul has fled. These weren't just poetic metaphors, they were clinical observations scribbled by healers desperate to make sense of something beyond their understanding. But what could have caused such terrifying symptoms? One compelling theory points to ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on damp grains like barley, Mesopotamia's staple crop. When ingested, ergot toxins can trigger hallucinations, muscle spasms, and even gangrene, making victims appear possessed or reanimated. Picture a farmer stumbling through the streets of Lagash, his fingers blackened, his mind conjuring demons in the flickering torchlight. To a society with no concept of microbiology, this wasn't disease, it was a curse spreading like shadow. Then there's leprosy, another likely suspect. Ancient medical texts describe skin rotting like autumn leaves and voices growing hollow as a tomb, details that mirror the slow decay of leprosy's advanced stages. But here's where myth takes over. Unlike modern leprosy, Mesopotamians believed the illness could steal the breath of life, yet leave the body walking. This idea of a half-living, half-dead state terrified them, weaving its way into purification rituals where sufferers were treated as if already ghosts. Yet the darkest clue lies in the Eridu Lament, a fragmented poem describing a city besieged by those who return. Unlike typical plague accounts, this text speaks of the dead rising not as spirits, but as physical threats, crumbling, ravenous, and utterly inhuman. Scholars debate whether this reflects mass hysteria during epidemics or a genuine cultural memory of some forgotten catastrophe. But one thing's clear, for the Mesopotamians, the line between disease and the supernatural was razor thin. A cough in the night wasn't just a cough, it might be the first sign you'd soon join the shambling horrors outside the city walls. What makes these accounts so haunting isn't just their visceral detail, but their eerie familiarity. Strip away the ancient language, and you'll find the same primal fears that fuel our zombie stories today: the terror of losing autonomy, of loved ones becoming monsters, of society crumbling under an unstoppable tide. The Mesopotamians may have called it Etimu or the Hand of Nergal, but their nightmare was in many ways ours, and that's why these crumbling tablets still matter. They remind us that the undead don't just stalk our screens. They've been lurking in our oldest stories all along. To understand why the undead struck such terror in the hearts of ancient Mesopotamians, you have to meet the gods who ruled over life, death, and the horrors in between. At the center of this pantheon stood Nergal, the ferocious god of plagues, war, and the scorching sun, a deity whose very name could make a farmer's blood run cold. Unlike modern visions of death as a silent reaper, Nergal was chaos incarnate, a bringer of fevers that burned through villages and battles that left fields littered with unburied corpses. But here's where it gets darker. Cuneiform texts describe Nergal not just as a destroyer, but as a jailer of the restless dead. When epidemics ravaged cities like Kish or Nippur, people believed Nergal had loosened his grip on the underworld, allowing souls to claw their way back into the world of the living. Then there was Ereshkigal, queen of the great below, whose realm wasn't some abstract afterlife but a tangible, suffocating place called Kur, a shadowy mirror of the world above. Myths tell of her palace where the dead drank dust and clay, forever hungry. But Ereshkigal wasn't just passive. She actively dragged souls into her domain, especially those who died unjustly. Tablet fragments from Sippar describe spirits twisting like smoke as she pulled them downward, only for some to escape as walking shadows. This wasn't just poetic imagery, it reflected very real fears about improper burials. Leave a body unwashed or a grave unsealed, and you risked inviting one of Ereshkigal's lost souls back into your home, rotting and ravenous. The intersection of these deities' powers created a perfect storm for zombie lore. Nergal's plagues weakened the barrier between worlds, while Ereshkigal's discontent sent spirits surging back. One ritual text from Asher even describes a protective spell against those who return from the Queen's table, implying the dead might bring their underworld hunger with them. And it wasn't just the common folk who feared this. Kings and priests took it seriously too. Royal correspondence from Mari mentions a breathless army spotted near the Euphrates, prompting the emperor to order mass purification rites. But perhaps the most telling clue lies in the myth of Ishtar's descent, where the goddess of love ventures into the underworld to confront Ereshkigal. At each gate, she's stripped of her divine attributes until she stands naked before death itself. When Ishtar finally escapes, she doesn't return alone. The text mentions attendants trailing behind her, beings neither fully alive nor dead. Some translations suggest these were plague victims cursed to linger between realms. It's a chilling parallel to modern zombie tropes, where contamination blurs the line between human and monster. What's fascinating isn't just that these myths existed, but how they shaped real-world responses. Archaeologists have found mass graves near with bodies stacked and weighted down by stones, a clear attempt to prevent the dead from rising. Medical incantations often invoked both Nergal and Ereshkigal, bargaining for protection. By the command of Ereshkigal, let this spirit return to darkness, reads one surviving tablet, pressed with the fingerprints of a healer who truly believed they were holding back the tide of the walking dead. These stories weren't mere entertainment, they were survival manuals written in the language of gods and ghosts. When a Mesopotamian mother whispered Nergal's name to ward off sickness, or a priest buried a figurine to seal Ereshkigal's gates, they weren't performing empty rituals. They were confronting humanity's oldest fear, that death might not be the end, but the beginning of something far worse. And in a world where plagues could erase entire cities, who's to say they were wrong? Beneath the ruins of Nippur, archaeologists unearthed something far more sinister than broken pottery or crumbling bricks. Small, folded sheets of lead etched with words meant to bend the will of gods and the dead. These cursed tablets, pressed into the earth over 2 millennia ago, weren't just angry scribbles, they were spells deliberately crafted to resurrect corpses as weapons. One chilling example, now housed in the University of Pennsylvania's museum, bears a message that translates roughly to, "Let Gula's breath fill his rotting lungs again. Let his hands clutch for his betrayers in the marketplace." This wasn't poetic exaggeration, it was a literal demand for the dead to walk, fueled by rage and the deep-seated belief that death could be reversed for vengeance. The mechanics of these curses reveal how tightly zombies were woven into Mesopotamia's cultural fabric. Tablets were often buried near graves or dumped into sacred rivers, believed to carry the message directly to the underworld's gatekeepers. Some invoked Ereshkigal by name, begging her to release the shadow of the slain upon an enemy. Others included gruesome details, descriptions of the deceased's wounds, locks of their hair, even soil from their burial site, all ingredients meant to tether the soul back to its decaying body. What's striking is how specific these curses were. One tablet from the Kassite period doesn't just summon a generic spirit. It instructs the risen dead to find the house with the blue door and drag him forth by his intestines. This level of detail suggests people didn't just fear zombies, they actively weaponized the concept. But why would anyone risk unleashing such horrors? The answer lies in Mesopotamia's brutal justice system. Without modern courts, vengeance often fell to the supernatural. If a murderer escaped punishment or a debtor refused to pay, the victim's family might commission a curse tablet as a last resort. In a society where proper burial rites were the only safeguard against restless spirits, the threat of being hunted by a revenant was more terrifying than any human retribution. The irony is that these very tablets may have fueled the zombie plague legends they sought to exploit. Imagine a drought-stricken village where a prominent merchant suddenly drops dead, only for curse tablets to surface in his home accusing a rival. Days later, a fever sweeps through the town, and in their delirium, survivors swear they've seen the merchant shambling through the barley fields at dusk. Whether by coincidence or mass hysteria, the myth becomes self-fulfilling. Even the act of burying these curses could have backfired. Archaeologists note many were placed near water sources, potentially contaminating wells with lead or other toxins that induced hallucinations and convulsions, symptoms easily mistaken for demonic possession. The most unsettling discovery came in 2012, when a dig near Nippur's temple of Enlil uncovered a cache of 34 tablets, all targeting the same family. Translators realized these weren't just individual curses, they formed a sequence, each spell layering on the last like some ancient necromantic ritual. The final tablet's warning still chills: "The last breath of my line will be the first breath of your doom." Whether this grim prophecy ever worked is lost to history, but its existence proves how deeply Mesopotamia believed in the power to turn graves into armies. These artifacts force us to reconsider what zombies really represented. They weren't just monsters, they were the ultimate societal pressure valve, a way to inflict suffering when human systems failed. Every folded lead sheet, every whispered incantation was a ticking time bomb of dread waiting to detonate into legend. And in a land where the dead were never truly gone, the line between curse and contagion was terrifyingly thin. Among the cracked and fragile medical papyri of ancient Mesopotamia, descriptions of certain plagues read less like clinical diagnoses and more like pages torn from a horror story. One particularly grim tablet, catalogued as the Nineveh Medical Compendium, details a sickness that stiffens the limbs as though bound by invisible ropes and drives the afflicted to bite at their own flesh as if possessed by the hunger of the underworld. These weren't just metaphors, they were precise observations recorded by healers who had no framework for diseases like tetanus or rabies, yet documented their effects with chilling accuracy. Take the case of rabies, known today to cause hydrophobia, aggression, and foaming at the mouth. A Babylonian text from Sippar describes patients gnashing their teeth like starving dogs, their spit thick as river mud. Without knowledge of viruses, the Mesopotamians interpreted these symptoms as demonic possession, specifically by the vengeful spirits of animals killed in hunts. Rituals to treat such cases involved sculpting figurines of snarling hounds and smashing them in ceremonial pits, a symbolic attempt to break the beast's grip on the sufferer. Even more haunting are the accounts of ergot poisoning, a fungus-induced condition that could trigger violent hallucinations and gangrenous limbs. A healer's notebook from describes an outbreak where victims walked with feet blackened as charcoal yet felt no pain, their minds lost in visions of the dead beckoning from darkened doorways. Modern toxicologists recognize these as classic ergotism symptoms, but to the Mesopotamians it was evidence of a far grimmer phenomenon, the physical body decaying while some unnatural force kept it moving. But the most visceral descriptions come from plague records tied to cannibalistic urges. The Eshnona outbreak tablet recounts a harrowing scene where the starving infected allegedly turned upon their kin with teeth bared. A detail later scribes may have embellished, but the core terror remained. In a society where proper burial rites were sacred, the idea of consuming the dead was more than taboo. It ruptured the cosmic order. Small wonder, then, that such outbreaks birthed legends of the undead returning not just to walk but to feast. What makes these texts so unsettling is their clinical detachment amid the horror. scribes noted symptoms with the same dispassionate precision used for recording tax inventories or star movements. One Assyrian healer's scroll even includes a mortality tally beside a haunting footnote. Of 20 cases, 3 survivors. These now fear the moon and whisper that their shadows move without them. Whether this referred to PTSD, neurological damage, or something more supernatural, the implication is clear. Some plagues didn't just kill, they transformed. These medical records weren't merely academic. They shaped rituals, laws, and even city planning. After a twisting sickness, possibly tetanus, struck laborers building the walls of Babylon, new ordinances required bodies to be burned with cedar oil, a practice previously reserved for execrated criminals. The reasoning, fire alone could ensure the breath of Nergal didn't linger in the muscles to reanimate them. In the end, the Mesopotamians may not have understood germ theory, but their observations bridged the gap between biology and myth. When they described a plague victim's unblinking eyes or mouth that chews air as if it were meat, they were documenting real suffering through the only lens they had, a world where sickness and the supernatural were inseparable. And in that space between science and legend, the zombie was born not as fantasy, but as the brain's desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable. King Sholgi's reign over was supposed to be a golden age, a time of towering temples, meticulous legal codes, and trade routes stretching from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. But beneath the glimmer of prosperity, something sinister festered. Clay tablets from his 38th year on the throne tell of a pestilence so gruesome, scribes hesitated to record its details. The sick did not lie still in their beds. One account from Nippur states, they walked as though pulled by unseen strings, their eyes white as sun-bleached bones. For a civilization that meticulously documented barley yields and tax receipts, these sparse, shuddering descriptions speak volumes. What could have terrified them so deeply that even their cuneiform, usually so precise, trembled with evasion? The epidemic's timing offers the first clue. Sholgi's later years were marked by relentless military campaigns and strained resources. Starvation weakened populations, making them ripe for disease. But this was no ordinary famine fever. Royal correspondence between and the city of Lagash describes quarantined districts where no lamentations were heard, because those who entered never came out alive or dead. Guards reported movements in the sealed-off alleys, shadows that didn't match the living. One particularly chilling tablet, now housed in the Louvre, recounts a soldier's testimony. We saw them through the barricades. They should have been corpses, yet their fingers scraped at the bricks like beetles trapped in a jar. Archaeology lends grim support to these accounts. Excavations at Ur's so-called plague quarter reveal mass graves with bodies contorted in unnatural positions, some with arms raised as if mid-struggle, others with jaws pried open in silent screams. More telling are the heavy stones piled atop many skeletons, a practice elsewhere reserved for suspected witches or blasphemers. Physical anthropologists note distinctive green staining on several bones, suggesting prolonged contact with copper, perhaps from amulets or burial masks meant to restrain the dead. But what truly cements this event as a potential origin for zombie lore is its aftermath. Sholgi, once celebrated as a divine ruler, abruptly shifted his policies. Decrees ordered the burning of infected corpses, a radical departure from Mesopotamian burial customs. Temples began stockpiling Kurabu figurines, winged guardians traditionally placed at doorways to repel demons. Most revealing of all, the king's own titles changed. Where earlier inscriptions boasted of his military conquests, later ones emphasized his role as the net that traps the restless dead. Could this have been the birth of the Mesopotamian zombie myth? Consider the parallels, a disease that blurred the line between life and death, a regime desperate to contain it with both fire and folklore, and a cultural trauma so profound it reshaped their understanding of the afterlife. The Roman III plague didn't just kill, It forced a civilization that worshipped order to confront chaos in its most visceral form, bodies that refused to stay buried, and a king who, for all his power, couldn't command the dead to obey. When the nights grew long and whispers of the restless dead slithered through Mesopotamia's alleyways, people didn't just bar their doors, they fought back with words sharper than swords. Among the most powerful weapons in their arsenal were the Maklu incantations, a series of Akkadian spells so potent they were recited for 9 consecutive nights, each verse a chain meant to bind the dead to their graves. These weren't mere whispers into the dark, they were full-scale ritual battles, complete with figurines molded from clay and wax, each one a stand-in for the vengeful spirits clawing at the edges of the living world. Picture this, a family huddled in their home as a priestess presses a tiny effigy into their hands, its features crude but unmistakably human. "Name your tormentor," she instructs, and with trembling fingers they etch a name into the figurine's belly. Perhaps a deceased relative denied proper burial, or a stranger who died screaming in the last plague. Then the real work begins. Salt, imported from distant deserts at great cost, is scattered in precise patterns around the effigy, not just for purification, but because Mesopotamians believed spirits couldn't cross its crystalline barrier. As the incantations rise in pitch, the priestess plunges the figurine into a pot of boiling beer, a symbolic destruction meant to sever the corpse demon's lingering ties to the mortal realm. But why such elaborate theater? The Maklu texts reveal a chilling worldview. The dead didn't just randomly rise. They were summoned by unfinished business, by unfulfilled curses, or worst of all, by the grief of those who couldn't let go. One particularly haunting spell commands, "May the love that calls you forth turn to ashes in their mouths." It's a gut-wrenching acknowledgement that sometimes the living were complicit in the horror, their mourning keeping souls tethered to rotting flesh. Archaeologists have unearthed caches of these cursed figurines beneath house thresholds and temple foundations, many with their heads ritually removed or spikes driven through their chests. Some bear traces of red ochre, a pigment linked to blood magic, while others are wrapped in scraps of linen likely torn from the death shrouds of the very spirits they were meant to contain. The most unsettling discoveries come from Mari, where a bundle of 7 figurines was found stuffed inside a hollow brick, each inscribed with a different symptom of the zombie plague: the one who hungers endlessly, the one whose hands scrabble at doors, the one whose breath smells of opened graves. What's striking isn't just the brutality of these rituals, but their precision. The Maklu spells don't just banish spirits, they dismantle them piece by piece. One incantation methodically strips a corpse demon of its senses. Take its eyes so it may not see the path home. Take its ears so it may not hear the weeping that lures it. Take its tongue so it may not speak the names of the living. Another forces it to confront its own decay. Behold your hands writhing with worms, behold your belly swollen with corruption. This wasn't just magic, it was psychological warfare against the undead, designed to horrify spirits into submission. Yet for all their ferocity, these rituals held an undercurrent of sorrow. Some texts include apologies to the dead, pleas for understanding as the living burned their offerings or shattered their effigies. A tablet from Sippar captures this duality perfectly. We break you to save you, we silence you to let you rest. In the end, the Mesopotamians weren't just fighting monsters, they were trying to free souls trapped in nightmares not of their making. And in that struggle, we see the birthplace of every zombie story since. The desperate human need to believe that even the most mindless horror can be stopped if only you know the right words. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving epic, holds a scene that chills the blood even after 4,000 years. A moment where death's door creaks open and something familiar yet wrong steps through. In Tablet 12, often called the Netherworld Tablet, Gilgamesh's closest friend, Enkidu, returns from the grave. But this isn't a joyful reunion or a fleeting vision. Enkidu's ghost shuffles into the narrative with palpable weight. his voice thick with the dust of the underworld, his body still bearing the wounds that killed him. The text describes him as clothed in shadows, his once vibrant strength now a hollow echo. What makes this encounter so unsettling isn't just the grief it stirs in Gilgamesh, it's the eerie precision with which it mirrors modern zombie tropes. Here's where scholars split like an axe through old bone. Some argue Enkidu's return is purely spiritual, a classic ancestor apparition common in global folklore. After all, he speaks wisdom about the afterlife, warning Gilgamesh of the fates awaiting different kinds of dead, a far cry from mindless, shambling monsters. But others point to visceral details, the way Enkidu's form is heavy as wet clay, how he lingers for an entire tablet instead of vanishing after delivering a message, even the peculiar emphasis on his physical suffering. Unlike typical ghosts who float through walls, this version of Enkidu seems anchored to his corpse, dragging its limitations with him. One line in particular haunts translators. When Gilgamesh reaches out, the text states, his hand passed through, yet also did not, as if Enkidu exists in some grotesque middle state between flesh and spirit. The debate intensifies when we examine what doesn't happen in this scene. Enkidu shows no hunger for the living, no mindless aggression traits we associate with zombies today. Instead, he's mournful, trapped, yet Mesopotamian demons like the Galu were known to physically seize victims, and underworld texts describe the Etemu spirits as capable of grasping and choking. Could Enkidu's return reflect an early, more nuanced take on reanimation? A being bound to his decaying form not by hunger but by unfinished bonds to the living. This ambiguity speaks to something deeper in Mesopotamian cosmology, their view of death as a corrupted mirror of life. In the descent of Ishtar, the underworld's dead eat clay and drink dust, their existence a twisted parody of earthly pleasures. Enkidu's return might then represent a soul unable to fully transition, stuck replaying fragments of its former self. Modern zombie narratives often explore this theme. Think of Pet Sematari's Gage Creed, whose resurrected form mixes childlike mannerisms with unnatural violence. The horror isn't just in the body's movement, but in the soul's distortion. Perhaps most telling is how Gilgamesh reacts. He doesn't burn his friend's remains or recite spells. He listens, weeps, and ultimately lets Enkidu fade back into darkness. This suggests Mesopotamians saw such returns as rare but natural, a temporary breach in the cosmic order that corrects itself. Contrast that with their frenzied rituals against Lilitu demons or vengeful spirits, and a pattern emerges. The real terror wasn't the dead coming back, it was the dead coming back wrong. Enkidu, for all his uncanny presence, still resembles himself. That distinction may hold the key to why this ancient tale feels so eerily familiar today. It's not a story about monsters, but about the unbearable tension between love and decay. In the end, Tablet 12 resists easy categorization. It's neither pure haunting nor full reanimation, but a third thing, a cultural fossil showing us the moment before zombies split from ghosts in humanity's imagination. And that liminal space where grief blurs the line between worlds might be the most terrifying place of all. To the Mesopotamians, the underworld wasn't just a distant realm, it was a gaping wound beneath their feet, a place so perilously close that the wails of the dead could sometimes be heard through cracks in the earth. They called it Kur, a word that didn't just mean land of the dead, but evoked a yawning chasm, a space where souls didn't rest so much as linger in a twilight existence. Picture a vast, airless cavern where the deceased drank dust from clay cups and gnawed on rocks to sate their endless hunger. This wasn't hellfire and brimstone, it was something far more visceral, a hollow reflection of life, stripped of all joy but not of sensation. And when plagues swept through cities like York or Lhasa, people believed the boundaries between worlds grew thin, allowing Kur's tormented souls to slip back into the land of the living, dragging their decay with them. The mechanics of this escape reveal how tightly Mesopotamians linked disease with supernatural breaches. Cuneiform texts describe the underworld as a sealed jar, its lid normally held firm by the weight of divine order. But during times of cosmic imbalance, solar eclipses, failed harvests, or especially virulent outbreaks, the seal could crack. One incantation tablet from Asher warns of the 7 bolts of Ker loosening, allowing those who walk upside down, a chilling euphemism for the dead, to climb back through graves or stagnant pools. These weren't metaphorical invasions. Priests performed rituals to physically reinforce burial mounds, piling stones not just over bodies but around entire cemeteries, as if building levees against a rising tide of corpses. What made these beliefs so potent was their basis in observable horror. When a plague victim's fever spiked, their skin cooling to the pallor of a corpse even as their limbs thrashed with unnatural strength, it was easy to believe something had crossed over. Medical texts from Mari describe patients speaking in voices not their own, sometimes cursing in languages they'd never known, details that align eerily with modern accounts of terminal lucidity or neuroinvasive infections. To a society without germ theory, the simplest explanation was possession by a cur escapee, a soul desperate to prolong its suffering by hijacking living flesh. The terror extended beyond individual possession. Omens spoke of death tides, moments when Ker's gates yawned wide enough to disgorge entire hordes. A fragmentary prophecy from the reign of Amisagika describes a wind from below carrying the smell of open tombs, followed by streets where the living walked shoulder to shoulder with those who should not walk at all. These weren't mindless zombies. Some texts specify they retained memories, even pleading with former loved ones before their bodies succumbed to the underworld's rot. Here lies the true nightmare, not faceless monsters, but recognizable souls trapped in a grotesque parody of life, their very presence poisoning the air like miasma. Archaeology offers grim corroboration. At Tel Brak, a mass grave from the Akkadian period shows bodies arranged in a circle, their hands bound behind their backs with copper wire, a practice otherwise unseen in Mesopotamian burials. The site's clay tablet simply states, "They rose, so we made them kneel forever." Nearby, jars of mercury and sulfur were found buried at cardinal points, elements believed to create a breathless barrier against underworld fugitives. Even the architecture of cities reflected this dread. The Ishtar Gate's famous glazed bricks weren't just decorative. Their cobalt blue was thought to mimic the firmament, creating an illusion of sky so thick that souls ascending from Ker would lose their way and sink back into darkness. Yet the most haunting evidence comes from personal prayers. A letter scratched onto a potsherd by a merchant's wife in Nineveh pleads, "If it is my son who knocks tonight, do not open. If he speaks with my son's voice, do not answer, for the dead know our names and the gate has no lock when love turns the key." In that single sentence, we grasp the true horror of Ker's intrusions, not just the threat of physical contagion, but the unbearable possibility that the monsters at the door might still carry the hearts of those you mourn. This belief system didn't just inspire fear, it shaped survival strategies. During outbreaks, families would smear door frames with bitumen, a tar-like substance believed to gum up the limbs of corpse walkers. Children wore amulets of the demon Pazuzu, not because he was benevolent, but because his dominion over disease winds made him a reluctant ally against the underworld's exhalations. Even the famous epic of Gilgamesh, with its lush gardens and quests for immortality, carries this undercurrent. When Sijuri warns Gilgamesh that the dead will outnumber the living, she's not speaking metaphorically. She's voicing a civilization's deepest dread, that one day Ker's lid might shatter completely and the balance between worlds would never be restored. In the end, Mesopotamia's zombie plague myths weren't just about death, they were about violation. The terror of Ker wasn't its suffering, but its proximity, a realm so close it could bleed into ours whenever the gods blinked. And in a world where a cough could herald the underworld's breath, where loved ones might return wearing familiar faces over rotting bones. Every burial was an act of defiance. A declaration that some doors once closed should never open again. Beneath the sun-baked earth of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered graves that tell a story far darker than simple burials. At the site of Tepe Gora, near modern-day Mosul, excavators found a mass grave unlike any other, dozens of skeletons stacked like firewood, their wrists bound with reed cords that had hardened into stone over millennia. Some skulls showed deliberate fractures, as if crushed post-mortem to ensure the dead couldn't rise. Nearby, a clay tablet fragment bore a single ominous line. They stirred at midnight, so we gave them stones to carry into eternity. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a calculated response to something these people feared enough to desecrate their own dead. Similar discoveries stretch across the region. In the ruins of Kish, a burial pit held 17 bodies arranged face down, a stark departure from the traditional Mesopotamian practice of interring corpses on their backs to face the stars. Forensic analysis revealed that several spines had been severed post-mortem, likely to cripple any attempt at movement. Even more chilling are the chamber graves of where victims of a suspected plague outbreak were sealed inside mud-brick vaults with their ankles shackled by copper bands. The metal's verdigris still stains the bones today, a ghostly echo of the belief that copper's purity could trap malignant spirits. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from Mari, where a royal archive detailed emergency measures during a breathless plague. Among the tablets was an order to dig mass graves 10 cubits deeper than a man's height, with instructions to lay a quicklime between corpses. Modern soil samples from these sites show pH levels so alkaline they'd prevent natural decomposition, suggesting the Mesopotamians weren't just trying to contain disease. They were ensuring the bodies couldn't physically reanimate. The grisliest finds come from the outskirts of Nippur, where 24 skeletons were uncovered with heavy basalt stones wedged into their jaws. Cuneiform records from the same period describe a tongue sickness that made victims gnash their teeth uncontrollably, a symptom modern physicians recognize as tetanus-induced lockjaw. To the ancients, though, this was proof the dead were trying to speak, to curse the living or call others to join them. By silencing them permanently, they hoped to break the chain of contagion, both physical and supernatural. What makes these burials so significant isn't just their brutality, but their consistency. From Sumer to Assyria, across 1,000 years, the same practices reappear: binding, weighing down, decapitating. This wasn't isolated hysteria. It was institutionalized terror baked into their funerary customs like poison in bread. Even their tools tell a story. At Tel Hamel, archaeologists found a cache of bronze knives buried near a plague pit, their edges notched from hacking through vertebrae. These weren't weapons of war, they were instruments of last resort, used to sever the ties between corpse and soul. The most haunting clue lies in what's missing. Normally, Mesopotamian graves overflow with offerings, food for the afterlife, amulets for protection. But in these plague pits, the dead were buried with nothing but the stones that pinned them. No prayers, no gifts, just the unmistakable message that these weren't souls to be honored, but threats to be neutralized. When the living stripped even the barest dignity from their dead, you know one thing for certain: they weren't just afraid of dying. They were terrified of what might come back. When Babylonian priests slit open a sacrificial sheep's belly, they weren't just hunting for dinner. They were reading the future in the glistening lobes of its liver. These liver divination records, meticulously pressed into clay tablets, form one of history's most unsettling archives. Amidst predictions of droughts and invasions, a recurring pattern chills the blood, warnings of walking shadows and the earth itself hungering. At first glance, these phrases might seem like poetic doomsaying, but zoom in closer and a terrifying precision emerges. One tablet from Sippar describes a liver with the gallbladder blackened as if by grave soil, alongside the prophecy: When the moon hides its face, the buried will climb, and their hands shall grope for the grain stores. This wasn't metaphor, it was a weather forecast for the undead. The mechanics of these omens reveal how deeply zombie fears were woven into Mesopotamian cosmology. Priests believed the liver, as the body's blood filter, held a mirror to the world's balance. A healthy liver meant harmony, a diseased one signaled cosmic fractures. Some of the most dire predictions came from livers showing worm-eaten marks, actual lesions likely caused by parasites but interpreted as signs of Nergal's teeth gnawing at the walls between worlds. Texts from Mari specify that such omens mandated immediate rituals, burying clay figurines at city gates to trip up the shadow walkers, and brewing beer infused with juniper, a plant believed to clog the nostrils of the dead so they couldn't scent the living. What makes these records so haunting is their specificity. A Nineveh omen tablet doesn't just warn of generic unrest, it states, if the caudate lobe bears 3 grooves like tomb bricks, the dead will rise first among the potter's quarter, for clay remembers its shape. This aligns eerily with excavations in that very district where kilns were found shattered from the inside out, as if something had crawled through unfired pottery. Another text from Ashur links gallbladder stones like clenched fists to outbreaks where victims allegedly coughed up grave dirt before attacking their families. Modern pathologists recognize these as symptoms of advanced tuberculosis or fungal infections, but to the ancient diviners they were proof the underworld was regurgitating its contents. The omens also expose a cruel irony in Mesopotamian theology. Their gods demanded these very liver readings, yet the solutions often involved tricking the divine. One ritual prescribed painting a healthy sheep's liver with ochre and presenting it to the temple after a bad omen, a divine sleight of hand to convince the gods the crisis had already passed. This hints at a society so traumatized by recurring nightmares of the walking dead that they'd rather risk celestial wrath than face the alternative. But the darkest insight comes from a little-discussed subset of omens tied not to disease, but to human actions. Tablets from Babylon's Esagila temple describe livers marked with blood pooling like an unsealed grave, predicting undead outbreaks specifically after mass executions or battlefield neglect. Here, the message is clear. The Mesopotamians understood that some horrors weren't acts of gods, but consequences of their own violence. When they left enemies unburied or slaves to die in collapsed mines, they weren't just breaking moral codes, they were literally digging doorways for the dead to return. These brittle clay tablets, with their meticulous cuneiform strokes, are more than archaic curiosities. They're survival guides from a civilization perpetually braced for the sky to darken with the wings of plague demons, or worse, for the earth beneath their sandals to grow soft with grasping hands. And in their terrified precision, they ask us a question that still echoes. When the signs point to doom, do you avert your eyes or start sharpening stakes? While Mesopotamia's walking dead clawed their way into history through terror and disease, other ancient cultures envisioned reanimation with startlingly different motives. Take Egypt, where mummification wasn't just about preserving corpses, it was a defense mechanism. The Book of the Dead contains spells specifically meant to prevent body parts from moving independently, a fear rooted in their belief that the deceased could physically return if their Ka life force grew restless. But unlike Mesopotamian Etimu, who dragged plague and hunger in their wake, Egyptian revenants were often bureaucrats of the afterlife. Judges, scribes, even tax collectors reanimated to settle unfinished business. A papyrus from Thebes describes a mummy rising not to devour flesh, but to collect an unpaid debt of 12 jars of wine, its bandaged hands clutching a ledger. The Greeks took a darker turn with their varikolokas, corpses said to bloat with blood and prowl villages for vengeance. What's fascinating is how geography shaped these myths. Islands like Lesvos, where soil was too rocky for deep burial, developed elaborate rituals, exhumations after 3 years, bones boiled in wine to ensure the dead stayed put. Yet unlike Mesopotamia's plague-haunted hordes, Greek revenants were solitary, often targeting specific families. A 1st-century grave inscription from Crete warns passers-by, "Do not wake Miltiades lest he ask why his son betrayed him." Here, the horror wasn't contagion but accountability, the dead returning to confront the living with unhealed wounds. But no culture fused possession and reanimation quite like Mesopotamia. While Egyptian mummies required intact bodies and Greek undead needed personal grudges, Mesopotamian zombies could be anything: a plague victim, a cursed enemy, even a stranger who died badly. The key difference: demonization. Cuneiform exorcism texts describe spirits riding corpses like chariots, twisting them into puppets of the underworld. A Babylonian tablet recounts a case where a girl's cadaver sat up mid-funeral, speaking in a guttural tongue later identified as the language of the Utuku demons. This wasn't just reanimation, it was cosmic hijacking, a body stripped of its humanity and repurposed as a weapon. The most striking contrast lies in treatment. Egyptians used golden amulets to plug corpse orifices against invading spirits. Greeks weighted graves with millstones, but Mesopotamians went further. Their death pits at Nippur contained headless skeletons buried with decapitated lizards, a symbolic severing of both human and animal reanimation. They didn't just fear the dead rising, they feared anything rising, a paranoia that bled into their medicine. Prescriptions from ashore include grinding scarab beetles into wound dressings, not for healing, but because insects represented uncontrolled movement, and crushing them was thought to still the twitching in a patient's limbs. Perhaps the most chilling distinction is in agency. Other cultures saw the undead as autonomous, vengeful, dutiful, or confused, but still themselves. In Mesopotamia, a zombie wasn't a person anymore. It was a hollowed-out shell repurposed by darker forces. When a scribe in wrote of the hands that move but the soul that does not, he wasn't describing resurrection. He was documenting an occupation, one that turned loved ones into doorways for something infinitely worse. That's why their rituals weren't just about restraining bodies but dismantling them. Breaking fingers, sewing lips with copper wire, filling eye sockets with bitumen, because in a world where death wasn't the end, the only way to protect the living was to make sure the dead could no longer hold anything at all. Amidst the dust-choked winds of Mesopotamia, two figures loomed larger than any plague or famine: Pazuzu and Lamashtu, the demonic architects of the walking dead. Unlike shadowy spirits or restless ghosts, these weren't mere tormentors. They were engineers of decay, reshaping corpses into vessels for their hunger. Artifacts unearthed from Nimrud to Nippur tell the story in unsettling detail. Bronze amulets show Pazuzu's grotesque, winged form hovering over beds of the sick, his taloned fingers pressing into their throats as if forcing death down like spoiled wine. And where Pazuzu brought the breath of pestilence, Lamashtu followed with teeth. Clay plaques depict her crouched on a victim's chest, her lion-headed maw clamped around their face, her hands wrenching the jaw unnaturally wide. These weren't symbolic warnings, they were diagrams of possession, showing how demons could hollow out a body and wear it like a shroud. The connection between these entities and the undead lies in their methods. Cuneiform exorcism texts describe Pazuzu as a wind that enters through the nostrils, paralyzing the lungs before seizing control of the limbs. A medical tablet from Sippar recounts a case where a suffocated patient sat up 3 days post-mortem, their voice now a guttural growl symptomatically identical to modern lockjaw, but to the Mesopotamians this was Pazuzu puppeteering the corpse. Even more chilling are the demon bowls found buried beneath thresholds inscribed with spells like, "Turn back, foul wind, lest you fill this house with those who walk backward." The phrasing is deliberate. Corpse possession wasn't just about movement but inversion, a perversion of natural order. Lamashtu's role was even more visceral. While Pazuzu corrupted the air, she preyed on flesh. A terracotta relief from ashore shows her cradling a zombified infant, its belly swollen with the black milk of decay. Texts accuse her of untying the sinews of the dead, leaving them pliant enough to reanimate but too rotted to resemble their former selves. Archaeologists have found skeletons in with vertebrae threaded with bronze wires, a physical attempt to re-secure what Lamashtu had loosened. The worst outbreaks were attributed to her laughing feasts, where she allegedly gathered reanimated corpses like gruesome dinner guests. One tablet from Nineveh describes a quarantine zone overrun by victims, whose mouths moved without speaking, whose hands clutched without gripping. A textbook depiction of advanced tetanus or rabies, but framed as Lamashtu's mockery of life. What makes these demons uniquely terrifying is their duality. Pazuzu, despite his horrors, was sometimes invoked against Lamashtu, a case of fighting fire with wildfire. Amulets bearing his snarling face have been found clutched in the hands of plague victims, suggesting people wore their enemy's image as a desperate shield. This paradox reveals a core truth. Mesopotamians saw the walking dead not as mindless hordes, but as battlegrounds for warring supernatural forces. A corpse shambling through the marketplace wasn't just a threat, it was a crime scene, evidence of some celestial power struggle spilling into the mortal world. Artifacts bring this nightmare into sharp relief. A ceremonial dagger from Mary's temple depicts Pazuzu vomiting into a corpse's mouth, while the handle is wrapped in linen strips stained with henna, a ritual attempt to dye death unnatural, marking the body as corrupted. Even children's toys weren't safe. Clay figurines from domestic sites show Lamashtu riding a reanimated donkey, its hollow eyes staring blankly ahead. These weren't fantastical stories, they were reflections of a world where every cough might herald demonic occupancy, where loved ones could become puppets strung with rotting sinews. The ultimate proof lies in the demon's own iconography. Pazuzu statues always show him with one hand raised in blessing, the other clutching a writhing serpent, a twisted parody of healing and harm. And Lamashtu's amulets, they depict her squatting over a victim, but if you tilt them just right, the shadows cast by the cuneiform inscriptions form the silhouette of a kneeling corpse. No accident. In a land where sunlight baked the bricks and shadows grew long, the Mesopotamians knew darkness didn't just conceal monsters, sometimes it wore their faces. The Era epic, one of Mesopotamia's most chilling texts, doesn't just describe a zombie plague, it reads like a divine bioterrorism manual. In this fragmented poem, the war god Era grows restless, disgusted by humanity's noise and prosperity. He doesn't just smite a few sinners, he engineers an apocalypse, whispering to the plague demon Namta, "Let your breath coil like smoke through their streets. Let the strong man stumble like a drunkard. Let the mother mistake her child for a stranger." What follows isn't natural disaster, but something far more calculated, a targeted dismantling of civilization, where disease doesn't just kill, it transforms. The epic describes victims whose eyes glaze like wet clay, who wander the ruins chewing their own tongues, their bodies puppeteered by Era's rage. But here's where scholars split. Was this mythic punishment, or a veiled account of ancient biological warfare? The poem's descriptions align unnervingly with real-world toxins. Take the black vomit Era unleashes. Modern experts note its resemblance to hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola, while others point to ergot-infected grain causing violent convulsions. Even the poem's geography is suspiciously precise. Era's plague begins in the docks of Babylon, where foreign ships unloaded exotic cargo, then spreads along the roads where merchants tread. Could this be a garbled memory of contaminated trade goods, a poisoned gift from a rival city-state? The smoking gun may lie in Era's accomplices, the terrifying Sabiti, 7 warriors forged from the breath of the underworld. Texts depict them not as soldiers but as vectors. They do not wield swords, but their touch curdles blood. Intriguingly, Assyrian military records describe besieged cities struck by the 7 fevers after accepting peace offerings of tainted grain. One Tel Leilan tablet recounts how an enemy's bread, baked with dust from the burial pits, triggered outbreaks where victims allegedly rose again to attack their kin. Whether factual or embellished, these accounts reveal a grim truth. Mesopotamians understood contagion could be weaponized. Perhaps most telling is what happens after Era's rampage. Unlike typical myths where gods relent, the epic ends with a boast. The tools are buried, but the hand remembers. This wasn't a one-time wrath, it was a threat left simmering. Archaeologists have found caches of Era tablets deliberately buried beneath city gates, some smeared with a substance later identified as fermented barley mold. Coincidence or a warning that the next plague might not come from heaven, but from human hands? The Era epic forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Our ancestors may have feared zombie plagues not just as acts of gods but as weapons of men. When the poem warns, "The dead are but one breath away," it's not describing superstition. It's documenting war, the oldest kind, where pathogens were the arrows, and the only armor was knowing how to recognize the enemy before they stopped looking human. The streets of Agade wail in the Curse of Agade, one of Mesopotamia's most haunting laments, where survivors don't just mourn the dead, they recoil from what comes back. "My brother knocks at dusk, his fingers bare bone," sobs one verse, yet his voice still sings our childhood songs. These aren't metaphors. The text details plague victims staggering through the ruined city gates, their bellies swollen with starvation yet mouths slavering for living flesh. What chills isn't just the grotesque imagery, but the raw specificity. The way a mother recognizes her son's limping gait despite his eyes like cracked pottery, or how a priestess describes bitten victims developing the same blackened tongues as their attackers within days. This isn't mythical embellishment, it's triage documentation. Compare this to the Eridu lament, where survivors whisper of the twice dead, those who succumb to plague only to reappear when mass graves flooded during seasonal rains. One passage describes laborers fishing corpses from the Euphrates, only for the bodies to sit upright in the nets, their waterlogged throats groaning. The horror here is ecological. The Mesopotamians understood decay's rhythms. They knew a sun-bloated corpse should sink, not float against the current. When the laws of nature inverted, they saw not superstition, but proof the underworld's gates had ruptured. Most telling are the bureaucratic elements woven through these laments. The Curse of Agade includes inventory lists of lost households, not just names but annotations like "husband devoured wife" or "child missing, footprints led to plague pit." These weren't poetic devices, they were legal records meant to absolve survivors of kin slaying when mercy came by club and torch. Even the language shifts from formal Akkadian to broken, panicked Sumerian in certain tablets, as if scribes reverted to their mother tongue under unimaginable stress. But the darkest thread runs through personal inscriptions on votive figurines. At Nippur, archaeologists found a clay statuette of a woman clutching her abdomen, its base inscribed, "Let my womb be barren, lest I birth another meal for the hungry ground." This wasn't defeatism, it was calculated resistance. By severing bloodlines, survivors hoped to starve whatever force animated the dead. The poetry of despair had become a weapon sharper than bronze. These laments force us to confront a brutal truth. The Mesopotamians didn't fear zombies because they misunderstood disease. They feared them because sometimes, against all reason, the dead did rise, not as metaphors but as fevered bodies stumbling through the moonlight. When the Curse of Agade wails, the gods have turned their faces away. It's not theology. It's the scream of a people watching their world become unrecognizable, one reanimated corpse at a time. Modern science might hold the key to unraveling Mesopotamia's zombie plague, not in dusty scrolls or ancient curses, but in the microscopic world of fungi and viruses. Picture this, the Tigris and Euphrates valleys swollen with seasonal floods, their humid air thick with the spores of opportunistic parasites. Among them, fungi like Ophiocodiceps, organisms that hijack their hosts' bodies, manipulating them into spreading infection, could have taken root in grain stores or even human tissue. Mesopotamian medical texts describe victims moving as if pulled by strings, their limbs stiff yet unnaturally coordinated, their mouths gnashing at the air like insects trapped in amber. Sound familiar? Today, we know cordyceps fungi force ants to climb vegetation before erupting from their heads, a grotesque parallel to the walking dead of ancient plagues. But fungi alone don't explain the rabid aggression scribes documented. Enter rabies, a virus that mirrors many zombie plague symptoms with terrifying accuracy. Babylonian healers wrote of patients foaming like mad dogs, their throats seizing at the sight of water, a hallmark of rabies' hydrophobic phase. The virus alters behavior, triggering aggression and hypersalivation, while neurological damage can cause bizarre post-mortem muscle spasms, making corpses appear to twitch or sit upright. In a society without germ theory, witnessing a rabies victim's final days or stumbling upon a body jerking with residual nerve activity could easily seed legends of the undead. Climate data deepens the connection. Sediment cores from Mesopotamian marshes show spikes in fungal growth during wetter periods, coinciding with outbreaks described in city annals. One tablet from Lhasa notes a plague following an unseasonable fog that clung like spider silk, a possible reference to airborne spores. Meanwhile, rabies thrives in densely populated areas with stray animals, both of which flourished near Mesopotamian canals. A veterinary text from Mari even warns of canine madness spreading after floods when jackals and dogs crowded into cities. The most compelling evidence lies in the treatments attempted. Excavated medical kits contain ergot-contaminated barley, a fungus now known to cause hallucinations and gangrene alongside copper blades possibly used to excise cursed flesh. Some prescriptions mention binding patients with ropes soaked in bitter water, likely salt solutions that would have slowed microbial growth. Even their obsession with fire burials aligns. Extreme heat destroys both fungal networks and rabies virions. Yet the Mesopotamians weren't wholly wrong about supernatural forces. Modern mycology reveals how some fungi synchronize outbreaks using chemical signals, creating waves of infection that resemble coordinated attacks. To an ancient healer, this would have looked like demonic possession, a literal shadow moving through communities. The truth, their zombie plague may have been a collision of biology and bad luck, where parasitic organisms exploited environmental cracks and human minds filled the gaps with monsters. When a scribe wrote of the dead rising by the breath of Nergal, he wasn't just spinning myth. He was documenting a perfect storm of nature's cruelty, one we're only now learning to decode. When a Mesopotamian village suspected the walking dead prowled among them, they didn't wait for symptoms to spread, they acted with brutal efficiency. Archaeologists at Tel Abu Salabik uncovered a set of clay tablets detailing protocols so precise they'd put modern CDC guidelines to shame. The first step was fire. Not just torching infected corpses, whole households were reduced to ash if a single member showed signs of the twisting sickness. A dispatch from the city of Eshnana orders the use of bitumen-soaked reeds to ensure flames would lick the walls clean, a method later confirmed by scorch marks found on foundation stones in plague districts. But the real horror lies in the rationale. These weren't attempts to sterilize. Texts describe fire as a way to starve the demons, denying them flesh to inhabit. Exile was another weapon. Victims displaying early symptoms, clouded eyes, unnatural stiffness, were dragged beyond city walls to the waste places, barren zones where even scavengers wouldn't tread. Excavations near revealed shallow pits filled with skeletons still clutching water jugs and moldy bread, their ankles shackled with copper chains. These weren't graves, they were holding pens, Cuneiform records from Nippur confirm the condemned were left alive, watched from afar by guards armed with slingshots, to strike those who stood when they should lie still. The cruelty had purpose. By observing how long it took the sick to transform, priests could predict outbreak waves. The most striking defenses belonged to the Ashapu, Mesopotamia's plague priests. Donning robes soaked in sesame oil and powdered lapis lazuli, they moved through infected areas like early hazmat teams. Their headdresses, reconstructed from temple reliefs, featured hollow reeds stuffed with myrrh-soaked wool, a primitive respirator filtering death's breath. But the true genius lay in their tools. Digs at Mari unearthed copper rods wrapped in linen, their ends charred from use. Translation of accompanying text reveals these were purifying stakes, heated until glowing and then pressed to door frames. Science backs the method. Copper's antimicrobial properties combined with heat would have created sterile barriers. What chills isn't just their ruthlessness, but their accuracy. At Gilgamesh, archaeologists found a quarantined merchant's house sealed with clay stamped by 7 different officials, proof of a coordinated containment system. The tablet inside lists each family member's symptoms day by day until the final entry. The silence has come. Now we wait 3 moons before breaking the seal. Modern epidemiologists note this matches the incubation period of diseases like rabies. Yet the darkest insight comes from who they blamed. While kings took credit for victories, outbreaks were always pinned on midwives, foreigners, or those who whisper to demons. A Susa tablet recounts how a healer named Taputi was walled alive inside a plague house, not for incompetence, but because she'd survived 3 outbreaks unscathed, proof, they reasoned, that she'd made a pact with the very forces she claimed to fight. In the end, Mesopotamia's protocols reveal a heartbreaking truth. Their battle against the walking dead was as much about controlling fear as containing disease. Because nothing terrifies a civilization more than realizing some threats can't be shackled, burned, or exiled away. Buried beneath the ruins of ancient libraries, the Udug Hull exorcism manual reads like a field guide for battling the walking dead. This isn't some vague collection of prayers, it's a tactical playbook, detailing exactly how to confront a corpse that refuses to stay in its grave. The rituals begin before sunrise, when the air is still thick with the scent of damp earth and the boundary between worlds is believed to be at its thinnest. A priest, barefoot to avoid echoing the footsteps of the dead, would circle the afflicted area 7 times counterclockwise, dragging a bronze sickle through the dirt to physically sever any unseen tethers to the underworld. The first line of defense, lapis lazuli amulets carved with the likeness of Pazuzu's snarling face. These weren't just decorative, they were tools. The manual instructs the priest to press the stone directly onto the corpse's forehead while chanting, "Blue as the sky, hard as the vault, this stone is a door that will not open." Modern mineralogists confirm lapis contains trace amounts of sulfur, a natural disinfectant, but to the Mesopotamians, its deep blue hue mirrored the firmament itself, creating a symbolic barrier the dead couldn't cross. Next came mandrake root, harvested under specific lunar phases with copper tools to avoid waking its spirit. The manual describes boiling the root in beer until it dissolved into a thick paste, which was then smeared across doorways and the corpse's joints. Toxicology studies show mandrake contains scopolamine, a compound that can induce paralysis, suggesting this ritual may have had the unintended side effect of chemically restraining convulsing bodies. But the text warns of a grimmer purpose. Mandrake was thought to confuse the hunger of the dead, blurring their senses so they'd forget the living. The most chilling step involves sound. A terracotta rattle filled with iron pellets recently unearthed at Nimrud was shaken in a precise rhythm while reciting, "Bones should rattle in wind, not in flesh." Acoustics researchers note the frequency produced matches the resonant pitch of human long bones, possibly triggering unsettling vibrations that mimic the dead's movements. It was psychological warfare, weaponizing the uncanny valley millennia before the term existed. but the manual's true genius lies in its escalation protocol. If a corpse persisted, priests were instructed to weave a net from dyed goat hair, red to represent life, black for death, and drape it over the body. Embedded with tiny copper bells, the net served as an early alarm system. Any movement would trigger metallic chimes, alerting watchmen. The final solution, a mix of quicklime and crushed juniper berries packed into the corpse's mouth and nostrils. Juniper's aromatic oils masked decay, while the lime accelerated decomposition, a brutal but effective way to ensure the dead had nothing left to animate. What's striking isn't just the manual's brutality, but its precision. These weren't desperate guesses, they were refined techniques tested across generations of nightmares. When a priest whispered, "By the command of E, Lord of the Deep, this flesh is a prison with no key," he wasn't reciting poetry. He was conducting an exorcism with the same calculated certainty as a surgeon closing a wound. And in a world where the dead could rise, that certainty was the only shield they had. The terror of Mesopotamian walking dead didn't vanish with the fall of Babylon. It mutated, seeping into the bones of later civilizations like a slow-acting curse. Centuries after the last cuneiform tablet was etched, Jewish scribes in the same region began recording tales of the golem, a creature molded from clay and animated by sacred words. At first glance, these hulking figures seem heroic, but older texts hint at something darker. The earliest golem legends describe them as mindless, uncontrollable, their bodies crumbling as their life force. The ruach fled like a breath from rotting lungs. Sound familiar? The parallels to Mesopotamian etimu are uncanny. Both are reanimated clay, both lack true souls, and both inevitably turn on their creators. A medieval Kabbalistic manuscript from Prague even warns that an imperfectly made golem will gnaw upon its own fingers, a grotesque echo of the zombie plagues described in Er's medical tablets. This wasn't mere coincidence. During the Babylonian exile, Jewish scholars absorbed and reframed Mesopotamian myths, transforming Nergal's corpse demons into beings that could be controlled, at least temporarily, by divine language. But the fear remained. The Zohar, a foundational Kabbalistic text, explicitly links golems to the death wind of the desert, recalling Mesopotamian incantations against Pazuzu's pestilential breath. Even the method of deactivation overlaps. Just as Mesopotamian priests shattered clay effigies to banish spirits, golems were neutralized by erasing the first letter of Emet, truth, from their foreheads, leaving Met dead. The DNA of the zombie myth had survived, repurposed but still pulsing with ancient dread. Fast forward to modern media, and the lineage grows clearer. The Walking Dead didn't just popularize zombies, it resurrected Mesopotamia's most terrifying plague tropes. Creator Robert Kirkman's viral outbreak mirrors the era epic's Black Vomit, with both spreading through social collapse rather than isolated bites. More tellingly, the show's walkers exhibit the same jerky, puppet-like movements described in cuneiform exorcism texts, a far cry from Haitian voodoo's graceful corpses. Even the iconic CDC episode nods to ancient science, with researchers dissecting walkers' brains much like Babylonian Ashapu priests examining sheep livers for demonic traces. But the most chilling parallel lies in societal response. Mesopotamian plague protocols, quarantine zones, burnings, the dehumanization of the infected are recreated shot for shot in 28 Days Later and The Last of Us. These aren't artistic choices, they're cultural memories. When World War Z depicts waves of sprinting undead overwhelming military barricades, it's visualizing the death tides warned of in Mary's liver omens. Even zombie comedy Shaun of the Dead borrows from antiquity. Its pub siege mirrors Mesopotamian demon bowls buried beneath thresholds, both using alcohol beer for the ancients, a Winchester rifle for Shaun as a last line of defense. The Mesopotamians would have understood our obsession. Their zombie myths weren't about monsters, but about watching the fragile walls of civilization crack under pressure. Every modern apocalypse story, from the Stand Superflu to the Girl with All the Gifts fungal horrors, retells that same primal nightmare. Because whether you're a Babylonian priest sealing a tomb with bitumen or Rick Grimes whispering, "We are the walking dead," the message is identical. The real terror isn't the outbreak. It's realizing how quickly we'll become the very things we burn. Massive mud brick walls weren't just Mesopotamia's defense against invaders. They were the first line of resistance against the undead. Archaeologists combing through the ruins of Uruk discovered something startling etched into the city's foundation stones. Intricate spirals and grid patterns, long dismissed as decorative, now revealed to be apotropaic marks, symbols meant to repel the supernatural. These weren't random scratches, they formed precise demon traps, geometric labyrinths designed to confuse and ensnare restless spirits. The logic was chillingly practical. If the dead couldn't navigate the symbols' twisting paths, they'd be stuck circling the walls eternally, unable to breach the living world. But the true genius lay in the gateways. At Babylon's Ishtar Gate, cobalt blue tiles shimmered with alternating reliefs of lions and dragons, not just displays of power, but a supernatural security system. Cuneiform inscriptions confirm the dragons were Mushasu, hybrid creatures believed to taste the breath of the dead, turning them away like divine bouncers. Even more ingenious were the thresholds themselves. Excavations at Nippur revealed grooves cut into gate foundations, fitted with hollow copper tubes filled with powdered lapis lazuli and sulfur. When night fell and temperatures dropped, these tubes would contract, releasing a faint, shimmering dust into the air, a barrier both chemical and mystical, since sulfur's disinfectant properties and lapis' celestial blue hue were thought to burn and blind corpse demons. The defenses grew darker underground. Beneath Ur's main gates, tunnels lined with bitumen-coated bricks funneled into spirit pits, chambers filled with shattered pottery and the bones of executed criminals. Texts from Sippar describe these as kennels for the underworld's hounds, where vengeful ghosts would be distracted tearing apart the remains of the damned instead of pursuing the living. Recent LiDAR scans of Nineveh's walls show these pits connected to sewage channels, suggesting a grisly failsafe. If spirits did breach the gates, floodgates could be opened to wash them back into the Euphrates with the night soil. Yet the most unsettling discoveries are the shadow drains, narrow slots built into defensive towers, just wide enough for a hand to slip through. At first assumed to be arrow loops, their real purpose became clear when excavators found them packed with corroded bronze blades and human teeth. Tablet fragments describe sentries feeding the walls during plague outbreaks, tossing the severed fingers of the infected into these slots so the fortifications themselves would hunger for the dead instead of the living. It was a grotesque bargain. The walls became living entities, their appetite for flesh redirected by architecture. These weren't just superstitions, they were calculated acts of psychological warfare. When a terrified farmer saw those labyrinthine symbols glowing in the torchlight, when he watched the blue dust puff from the gate's base at dusk, he wasn't just witnessing magic, he was experiencing one of history's first biosecurity systems. Every brick, every groove whispered the same promise. Here, the dead would find no welcome. And in a world where plagues walked on two legs, that illusion of control was as vital as the walls themselves. The real horror wasn't the zombies, it was the dawning realization that no barrier, no matter how brilliantly designed, could hold forever. Hammurabi's famous law code didn't just dictate punishments for thieves or runaway wives, it was also a desperate shield against the creeping horror of the undead. Among its 282 laws, one passage stands out with eerie specificity. A man whose hands are unclean shall not touch the temple gates, lest the dead rise through his fingers. This wasn't poetic metaphor, it was public health policy. Excavated tablets from Sippar reveal how clean hands rituals went far beyond hygiene. priests scrubbed their palms with a paste of natron salt and crushed tamarisk, a plant believed to seal the pores against the breath of Ker. Even the royal court wasn't exempt. A letter from Hammurabi's physician describes the king soaking his hands in vinegar between audiences, not for sanitation, but because sour liquids were thought to confuse the dead senses by masking the scent of living flesh. But Hammurabi's most drastic measure came in his 29th year of rule, when a wave of twisting sickness struck Babylon. Clay annals describe how he ordered every temple in the empire whitewashed with a slurry of lime and pulverized lapis lazuli, a grueling project that turned entire cities into shimmering blue fortresses against the supernatural. The reasoning, texts from Mari explain that the dead move through shadows, so by eliminating darkness even at noon, the king hoped to starve the plague of its pathways. Modern chemists analyzing residue on these walls found traces of copper oxide, suggesting an unintended benefit. The mixture may have acted as a primitive fungicide, slowing the spread of ergot-infected grain that could have fueled hallucinations of the walking dead. Not all royal responses were so calculated. When an outbreak ravaged the city of Eshnana, King Ipik-Adad Roman II took a page from his ancestors' nightmares. Tablets record how he marched into the plague district wearing nothing but a lion's pelt and a crown of garlic, dragging a bronze plow to carve a ritual trench around the infected quarter. This wasn't mere theater. The plow was inscribed with the names of 7 underworld demons, turning the furrow into a spiritual moat. Workers followed, dumping the corpses of executed criminals into the trench along with sulfur and crushed onyx. Archaeologists found one such trench in 2011, its contents still potent enough to make their gloves disintegrate from the concentrated sulfur. Perhaps the most chilling royal intervention came from the Assyrian queen Nakia, who ruled as regent after her husband's death. Facing whispers that the late king's spirit was walking the halls with hunger in his eyes, she didn't just purify the palace, she rewrote the afterlife itself. A recently deciphered tablet from Nineveh details how she commissioned a mirror image replica of the royal tomb deep beneath the citadel, stocked with wax effigies of servants and livestock. Every month, priests would descend to refresh these figures, pouring water over their mouths in a twisted parody of feeding. The goal, to trick any restless dead into haunting the decoy instead of the real world. Forensic analysis of the dummy tomb's walls revealed thousands of microscopic claw marks, suggesting something rats, desperate priests, or something less easily explained had tried frantically to escape. These rulers weren't just battling disease, they were fighting a war of perception. When Hammurabi inscribed his laws on basalt steels, he knew the real power lay not in the words themselves, but in the unshakable certainty they projected. A king who could dictate how to handle undead outbreaks was by implication a king who could control them. That illusion of order was perhaps their most potent weapon, because in a land where the dead might rise at any moment, the living would cling to any leader who promised the graves would stay shut. Even if it meant washing their hands until the skin cracked. The dread of ancient Mesopotamia didn't fade into dust, it slithered into the 20th century, reshaping itself in the typewritten nightmares of H.P. Lovecraft. Take Cool Air, a story that feels ripped straight from the clay tablets of Babylon. On the surface, it's a tale about a chillingly rational doctor preserving his corpse with mechanical refrigeration. But peel back the layers and you'll find the same terror that haunted the streets of Ur. The horror of a body that refuses to decay, a mind trapped in rotting flesh defying nature's order. Lovecraft's Dr. Munoz, with his chemical solutions and whirring machinery, is just a modern incarnation of the Mesopotamian Ashapu priests, both desperately staving off corruption with the tools of their time. The real horror isn't the cold air, it's the moment the power fails and the ancient stench of Ker rises from the vents. Lovecraft didn't just borrow tropes, he channeled the same existential dread. In Mesopotamian myth, the dead returned because the gods grew careless. Ker's lid cracked and chaos spilled through. Lovecraft's cosmos operates on the same principle. His stories whisper of gaps in reality, dimensions where the dead don't just walk but writhe in geometries beyond human comprehension. The Whisperer in Darkness mirrors the era epics plague demons both depict intelligences that wear corpses like suits, puppeteering them to sow discord. When the Migos surgically empty a human brain to wear its body, they're fulfilling the same role as Pazuzu, the Mesopotamian wind demon who inflates corpses like rotten wineskins. The tools changed, but the terror remained. Even Lovecraft's architecture echoes Mesopotamian defenses. The labyrinthine streets of Arkham, with their gambrel roofs and oddly angled alleys, function like Nippur's demon trapping walls, both designed to confuse and contain what shouldn't exist. His protagonists often recite forbidden incantations, just as Babylonian priests muttered the Udug-Hol spells, each syllable a barricade against the dark. And when those words fail, the result is pure Mesopotamian horror. In Herbert West Reanimator, the cadaver that shudders awake isn't a Frankenstein's monster. It's a Babylonian etimu, a soul dragged back into a body it no longer recognizes, its movements jerky and puppet-like. West's serum is just mandrake root and juniper berries repackaged for the atomic age. The most chilling parallel lies in what these stories reveal about human nature. The Mesopotamians believed plagues were cosmic corrections, punishment for cities grown too loud, too proud. Lovecraft's horrors often arrive when humanity peers too boldly into the abyss. His characters don't just die, they unravel, their bodies warping as if Kerr itself is reshaping them. The color out of space could be a cuneiform account of Era's vengeance. Both describe a creeping corruption that twists flesh and sanity, leaving husks that mimic life. Even Lovecraft's infamous racism reflects the ancient fear of the other, the outsider who carries contagion, whether literal or existential. But here's the twist: Lovecraft's mythos lacks the Mesopotamians' fragile hope. Their rituals, however brutal, implied the dead could be restrained by human will. His universe offers no such comfort. When the narrator of Cool Air flees the doctor's apartment, leaving the thing in the chair to liquefy, it's the inverse of a Mesopotamian exorcism. No chants, no copper blades, just the realization that some horrors outlast all defenses. That's the true legacy of the zombie plague myths, a fear so primal it transcends time, evolving but never fading. Whether carved in clay or typed on a pulp magazine page, the message is the same. The dead don't stay dead, and the walls between worlds, they were always thinner than we dared admit. In the shadow of Mary's great ziggurat, Dr. Lina al-Azawi kneels beside a pit where the earth still remembers panic. The skeletons here aren't laid to rest, they're tangled, their limbs twisted like knots in a rope, fingers curled into the dirt as if trying to claw back to the surface. This isn't burial, she says, brushing dust from a skull still wedged upside down between two pelvis bones. This is containment. For the past 5 seasons, her team has excavated what locals call the Breathless Quarter, a district sealed off by mud brick walls during a suspected outbreak around 1800 B. See, the findings read like pages from a horror manual. Jaws pried open with copper wedges, spinal cords threaded with lead wire, even a child's skeleton found clutching a clay figurine of Pazuzu, its wings snapped off. What makes Mary's plague district unique isn't just the violence of these burials, but their precision. Unlike haphazard mass graves from wars or famines, these bodies were immobilized with methodical cruelty. Dr. Al-Azawi points to a cluster of skeletons near the old canal, each ribcage weighed down by basalt stones, their legs bound at the ankles with reed cords knotted in complex patterns. These aren't just restraints, she explains. The knots match those used in contemporary demon-binding rituals. They weren't just afraid the dead would rise, they feared what might ride their bones back up. The most chilling evidence comes from a recently unearthed cellar beneath a merchant's house. Dozens of amphorae lay shattered, their interiors scorched. At first, archaeologists assumed they'd held oil or wine until residue analysis revealed traces of juniper, sulfur, and something darker. Bitumen mixed with ground lapis lazuli, says chemist Dr. Elias Petros holding a vial of the blue-black powder. We've found references to sky fire in Mary's texts, a substance burned to create smoke that confused the dead. Now we know it wasn't metaphor. The cellar's ceiling bears claw marks too high for any human, their spacing suggesting something with elongated fingers tried desperately to escape the fumes. But the real breakthrough emerged from the teeth. Isotope testing on molar enamel from the plague victims revealed abnormally high levels of ergot alkaloids, toxic compounds from fungus-infected grain. This wasn't just superstition, says paleopathologist Dr. Rachel Nguyen, holding an X-ray of a skull showing telltale pitting in the sinus cavity. These people were hallucinating, convulsing. Imagine watching your neighbor's corpse sit up during a seizure, their eyes rolled back, foam bubbling from their mouth. You wouldn't think disease, you'd think curse. The team's most haunting discovery lay beneath the city's main well, a layer of skeletons arranged in a spiral, their hands cupped around empty ceramic bowls. At the spiral's center, a single intact tablet, its cuneiform still crisp. Let their thirst be quenched by dust, their hunger sated by stone, so they walk no more in the land of the living. Modern hydrology tests later confirmed the well had been deliberately poisoned with lead and nightshade during the outbreak, not to kill the living, but to starve whatever might rise from their graves. As dusk falls over Mary, Dr. Al-Azawi pauses at the edge of the dig, her shadow stretching long across the broken ground. We used to assume zombie myths were just stories, she murmurs, tucking a shard of pottery into her pocket. But when you see how hard they fought to keep the dead buried, part of me wonders if they knew something we don't. Above her, the first stars blink awake, the same ones that once watched these streets burn with panic and bitumen when the line between fever dream and walking nightmare dissolved into screams. The echoes of Mesopotamia's zombie plague still reverberate through time, not as mere superstition, but as a chilling collision of myth, medicine, and mortal terror. What began as whispers on crumbling clay tablets unfolds now as a forensic nightmare, a civilization besieged by diseases they couldn't name, deaths they couldn't explain, and corpses that refused to stay buried. From the ergot-poisoned grain that twisted minds to the rabies victims foaming like cursed dogs, their medical records read like horror scripts. Yet these weren't just clinical observations, they were battle logs from a war against the unseen, where priests wielded copper blades and juniper smoke like soldiers holding the line against an army of the damned. Archaeology peels back the layers of their panic. The mass graves with stones piled on chests, the skeletons bound in ritual knots, the amulets of Pazuzu clutched in skeletal fingers, all whisper the same truth: this wasn't fantasy. It was protocol. When the Mesopotamians burned plague houses or sealed victims alive in brick tombs, they weren't acting on blind fear. They were responding to something visceral, something that walked the knife's edge between pathology and the paranormal. Even their gods reflected this duality. Nergal wasn't just a destroyer, he was a coroner tallying souls while his demonic hordes tested the locks on the underworld's gates. But here's the unsettling twist: their horror wasn't irrational. Modern science confirms the foundations of their dread. Ergotism does induce hallucinations of monsters. Rabies can make the dead seem to twitch back to life, and mass trauma, it warps memory, blurring the line between survivors' guilt and spectral visions. The Mesopotamians may have dressed their plagues in demon masks, but they weren't wrong about the existential threat. A society's collapse does feel like the dead rising, when order crumbles, when loved ones become strangers, when the past won't stay buried. Which leaves us with that final, creeping question. If ancient germ theory birthed these nightmares, what terrors might our next pandemic unleash? We've mapped the human genome, but we've also engineered viruses in labs. We've conquered smallpox, yet weaponized anthrax. The Mesopotamians feared the dead climbing from Ker. We fret over AI resurrecting digital ghosts or synthetic pathogens rewriting life itself. Their zombies were metaphors for chaos. Ours might wear hazmat suits, so as the dust settles over Nippur's plague pits and Mari's bone-filled trenches. Consider this. The scariest part of their story isn't that they were wrong about the Walking Dead. It's that they might have been right just ahead of schedule. After all, humanity's oldest fear wasn't death. It was what comes after, and in a world where science can reanimate cells and algorithms mimic the departed, who's to say the next pandemic won't blur that line all over